So I'm very excited to have Arthur Brock from Holochain here to chat at our Fireside-ish chat this morning and this evening for you, Art. Thanks so much for joining us here and what we're doing with IOEN, and just so excited to have this conversation with you. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's good to be here, and I'm excited about all the progress you guys have been making. It's good to see these things coming together.
Thanks, man. So look, we're going to dive into some really exciting stuff. We'll talk through technology. We'll talk what brought us both into this space and why Holochain and IOEN and RedGrid are working so closely together. If you're joining the show right now, please make sure you get straight to our Telegram channel. Join up to our Telegram channel at IOEN_global. Follow us on Twitter. Get into the IOEN community, because I think what we want to. I mean, this is something that you and I've talked about a lot. It's like how do we form community? How do we build technology that supports community? And so yeah, please everyone jump in, get on there. And if you want to support us in our community, please direct message Harry, who's our community ambassador leader at our team, who will help you kind of become more part of the IOEN journey. So there's also some really awesome articles from Holochain that have just come out that we'll point to later in our conversation. But yeah, Art, when do what's this been, like 3 years now that we've been working on this together, I think? And
yeah,
wow, it's kind of like gone super fast. It feels like, at least. What is it from your perspective? What's the relationship between us guys, and like how you saw it and what you were doing at Holochain, and tell us a bit about what your time was in Australia as well.
Yeah, so back before pandemic shut down travel, I was kind of on tour doing a little bit of the Holochain show, like leading hackathons in different places, helping people learn how to build on Holochain, and helping with other sort of more complex design patterns, people that are trying to solve difficult problems. And what you guys were looking at in terms of being able to kind of do smart energy and have energy wisdom in play, both in terms of demand curve, but also really in terms of more of a local edge, peer-to-peer availability. That's complex stuff. And being able to have the sit downs with you about what your goals were and what you're up to, and about the possible currency designs and incentives, and about the structure of the software and the marketplaces for energy exchange, and the currencies for engaging in this, and the bindings of it to locale, like how energy, Holochain has this adjunct hosting company as part of its revenue strategy, but we were able to do this. We're able to build like an asset-backed currency backed by hosting, because there's one internet and we can host across it everywhere, right? But there isn't just one energy grid, right? Those things have regional bindings and national bindings, and and you just have a different set of constraints you're operating inside of. And yet it's one of the next kind of natural things, at least in the framework where I have a desire for Holochain to help catalyze these asset-backed currencies backed by real human needs, like energy and food and housing, and hosting, which most people don't think of as a real human need until you realize that, we walk around with these computers in our pocket, and what allows us to talk to each other through them is some form of hosted application, typically, right? And so until we have a way of replacing that kind of infrastructure with things that are truly peer-to-peer, all of our kind of communication and coordination on all scales relies on this. And it just was a natural fit. And your background in some of the environmental aspects also comes into play, because we're so based on nature.
Yeah, so it was the environmental. So you were interested in us because you knew our environmental background and what we were kind of bringing together, right?
Yeah, and I just mentioned because so many of the patterns of Holochain are designed on natural principles.
Yeah. See, that's the thing that really got me. So when we met, a few years ago, So my background's in ecology, and then I did carbon finance and all this kind of stuff. But when I met you and the team, and we were talking through all this stuff, and you were explaining the nature-based approach, for me, it made so much sense. When you study ecological systems, you start to understand how things happen at the edge and they influence each other. And it's never just static. It's always a constant, like, dynamic equilibrium. And that's what, when we started talking about this, I remember walking back to the train station because I live in the country, and I was getting home, and I was like, we were walking back that one evening thinking, wow, these guys have got something which is completely different to everything we've seen so far. And not just technically, but also philosophically, and also kind of the way we talked about it. I remember you talking about it with us in terms of saying, it's the currency isn't currency like fiat. It's a current you can see. It's something flowing in the system. And that really stuck with me as something that's completely different to what we've seen in blockchain so far, but also just opens up the horizons for what we could do in energy so much further than we can in just having blockchain. And that's why we put together the hybrid system of an ERC20 token in blockchain with DeFi. That's all great. That's excellent. But on the local level, as you said, these different grids need different capabilities and an organic kind of nature to them, which is awesome. And one other thing you said is, like, working through the Creffellian upward spiral, this kind of like this thing where you can make tiny little changes that have huge impacts down the line. And there's an amazing video by George Monbiot about Yellowstone and the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone and how it shapes the landscape. Like, it's incredible how these if you make the right small adjustments, really amazing things can happen. It just blew my mind, man. It was so cool because we've been searching and we couldn't find the right technology until we found Holochain. So and until we work together as well as like people, because you gotta be people in the end. So it was exciting, and that was it, right? That was kind of
totally. There was no question it was the right fit.
Yeah, it was fantastic. So what brought you, like, just briefly, I mean, you've done lots of these kind of conversations, what brought you to Holochain, but what made you kind of, why is art in Holochain right now? Like, what is the kind of, just the sort of top line headlines of, why is it so important for you to be doing this at this point?
Well, I don't know. I feel like I have been seeking for many years. I've been seeking the trim tabs, the leverage points for change. Like, where is it? Like you're talking about, you can build this upward spiral, but only if you actually can change the slope upward instead of downward and have it be an erosive spiral. And that takes some leverage because our existing system is so stuck in kind of erosive, depletive, extractive patterns. And so what are the leverage points for change? Because change doesn't happen easily, and so how can I apply the least amount of pressure and produce the greatest amount of the greatest effect, the greatest impact? And, part of what became clear to me as I did experiments in different spaces of, education and business and different things, and eventually currencies as the feedback, as the things that make visible different patterns of flow. Now, when money is the only currency we look at, then there's a very limited landscape that we see. And then we talk about like monetizing ecosystem services and, that kind of stuff in order to make visible the benefits of nature and that kind of thing. But that's not necessarily the right way. It's a way of thinking about that. But the thing is that currency is so powerful because if you can change that, it sort of changes the fabric or structure of the incentives, then everybody else uses all their creativity to optimize their behavior to the new incentives, right? And so you don't have to go out there and convince people they should do something different. You just tilted the playing field of incentives, and they're out there trying to figure out how to game it and how to do better, how to get more. Now, you can see that happening in the crypto space, but the crypto space hasn't actually shifted the fundamental pattern. The pattern is still extractive. It's still short-term speculative. It's still, which is a little bit of an upside down relationship to building the long-term patterns of regeneration and the upward spiral of shared wealth. Essentially, it's still an extractive individual wealth pattern, but you can see how much that's altered behaviors, right? All sorts of people jumping into the crypto markets, and like you can see people scrambling for these new systems. And so there was the issue of currencies as this leverage point, but the limitation of all of our existing technology to implement them appropriately, because everything is centralized, including current approaches to decentralization, including blockchain, is too centralized for what we needed. We needed something that we call an unenclosable carrier. Basically, there's no points of control. There's no choke points where centralized control can enter into the picture and be able to because if that exists, then that is an Achilles heel where the system then can become corrupted by exerting influence at that choke point. And so we really needed this unenclosable carrier for currencies. And I would say, like, now I translate it even broader to new unenclosable carrier for new ways of organizing, collaborating, coordinating. So I call it social DNA, right? Because if you think about when DNA arrived on the planet, the world noticed, right? Like we were able to organize in very complex ways, right? To have unenclosable carriers for social DNA that can't be corrupted and controlled by governments, by other corporations, by monetary markets. Basically, as long as anybody wants to play, nobody can stop them, because it's completely peer-to-peer with no points of centralization, even in that peer-to-peer framework. And that's why Holochain, that's why I'm doing it, is that we can't even build the new incentive landscapes on the old tilted centralized infrastructures, because they become corrupted by the existing powers that be and controlled by the existing powers.
Super interesting, because it's so much of what you're saying here parallels what's happened and happening in energy. Like that's that whole full decentralization, and you know, we've been in this energy space, just as you said, for the last 150 years with the same system, and it had to be that way. Like we had to have centralized fossil fuels. It was the best option at the time, and you know, you can't blame anyone for doing that. It was a great option. We all got electricity from it. Fantastic. We just didn't know the impact that was going to have. But now we see the impact on climate change, the impact on, you know, wealth distribution, all that kind of stuff. But it made a really big difference to society. But now we're kind of in this space where this new technology has emerged and become so prevalent and so easy to use, so cheap. Solar, like decentralized. I mean, you got solar panels on top of where you are right now. I got solar panels in our house up here. Like it's kind of, and there's a lot of people who don't have solar, but who can now participate in it. I think that's the challenge we've seen in this clean energy revolution, is that we're in this kind of technological transition, and right now it's still being centralized with that technology. That, you know, basically there's not everyone can have access to solar, not everyone can have access to some of this clean energy, because some people don't own their houses, some people have to live in apartments or live in different places. That's one of the problems we've seen in this kind of decentralization and re-centralization of stuff. And you start to get the same kind of patterns emerging. And I think that's what excited us about this, and why we kind of wanted to form ION as a fundamentally different way of looking at this in the blockchain and the holochain world, is to say, hey, you don't need to be signed up to a big scheme to be part of this. All you need to do is, you know, buy some ION tokens, get your mobile wallet and stick it in there and start participating in the ecosystem, however small that is. Because that tiny little bit from the edge can then connect to someone else at the edge. And this is why Holochain is so powerful, because of the DNA can see each other, the different agents can see each other and start to coordinate. You start to form these small in energy. You can start to match then this decentralization of energy resources, but also not have to be the person who owns the solar. You can have your mobile app. You can take some action in your house. You can respond to signals and be part of that energy revolution, because the grid, Paul has just put out this amazing article that we'll put a link into below on the Holochain blog, that just talks about this so well. And it just shows the duck curve and all the kind of stuff we've got happening now that are problems with renewable energy. But there's kind of small changes, more people participating at the edge means we get to super decentralize who's participating, but we also get to include everybody. And so far, there's been this mantra of democratization of energy, but it hasn't really happened. and yet there is a massive call for it. Like we're talking to, you know, retirement villages who want to do this. We're talking to small communities who want to have more autonomy over how they do this. And now, funnily enough, the networks are coming to us and saying, hey, we're kind of interested in this because we've got a business model that's getting archaic. You know, we can't just keep spending money on infrastructure. We need to spend money on being smarter. So I love that kind of the bit where you're talking about, hey, it's about this the social DNA, the DNA of the social DNA of the structures, but also the DNA in the technology. And that's what we call it, right? It's like organisms working together, like the primordial soup of, you know, 4 billion years ago, when RNA came along and suddenly it started to cooperate and do things with each other and form life as we know it. It's insane. I mean, that's, fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about like the, you know, IoT, the Internet of Things, and the types of little smart devices that are going to emerge. And then you talk about a smart grid, a smart network like this, and you want to have like little devices that can say, hey, I'm producing surplus, or this is my demand, this is my surplus, this is my, you know, and be able to negotiate with each other, except the frameworks we have for doing that are too heavy. Right? They can't run on those little devices. Like blockchain type approaches require huge dedicated things for, you know, proof of work, or they, you know, and they because they're managing consensus, they don't have the resilience to deal with network partitions and, you know, things like that where Holochain can keep functioning even in sub networks. Right? As long as there's other peers to talk to, you're still playing the game with those other peers. Whoever you can reach, you're still operating inside the same set of agreements. And it can be lightweight enough. Like the current Holochain binary is somewhere around 30 meg or something like that, as opposed to, you know, like the IOTA, which is supposed to be an Internet of Things chain, you know, that requires 64 gig, not meg, gig of RAM to just run the Tangle. You can't run that on an Internet of Things device, on an IoT device. Like, you just don't have that kind of RAM and compute power at the edge. You know, so the only way to make this feasible is to have to follow these patterns of nature, that like cells are these little engines that do a lot of complex stuff, but they don't synchronize their state with a global ledger. That is a level of complexity that they're not attempting, and is not really feasible to have trillions of them orchestrating and trying to synchronize all their state changes against a global ledger.
That's right. And that kind of, you know, the ideal of having that small lightweight code out of these devices means those devices provide resiliency then, right? Because you're not having to rely back on a central source. You're not having to have global consensus. This is super important. I mean, we see this, Paul points out in the article as well, we see this with more extreme weather events in the electricity grid. We start losing the grid because there's more extreme events coming from climate change. One grid goes down over here and knocks out the rest of it. Whereas if we have these kind of cell-based agents working in these virtual microgrids, one bit might go down, but it can be supported by the others. And actually our CDO sim has simulated this. Like, actually there's a distress point and these other agents can come to its aid. And that can only happen, right? When you're talking through this in this agent-based approach, there's just not the intelligence to make it happen in another way, or the capacity. Yeah.
Well, and that is, you know, one of the ways that we distinguish Holochain from blockchain is agent-centric versus data-centric. And so having this agent-centric thing where each of these nodes is an autonomous agent, it has a rule set. If it's running the RedGrid app or the ION app, you know, it has a rule set by which it's interacting with the other agents, but it doesn't lose its agency just because millions of other nodes have suddenly become inaccessible.
Yes.
It can still be talking to the dozen in the retirement community that are still there, and be moving energy around and be negotiating those things, you know, like it's still doing its thing.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a kind of a bit of a shift, isn't it, in mindset, to actually think about that, like from thinking through, you know, just like, I mean, we work with APIs, right? And then, right, to be honest, like for us right now, it's a hybrid model. We're sort of, you know, we're pushing things to the edge. We're not fully at the edge right now with RedGrid and ION, just because there's a lot of stuff that has to happen in the meantime. And, you know, we've got to go on that journey. And but it's kind of, it feels like it's a sort of an inexorable journey. And that's why, you know, building a launch like this, or building a protocol like ION, which is an open source protocol, I'll loop it back to what you said earlier around people's creativity, is that if you can create the protocol like you guys have done with Holochain, and you can create a protocol that does a specific thing, just helps people understand and transact energy use value, then other people can come up with applications and creative ways of using that are locally appropriate, and other developers can play, and they can either sell it to people or they can give it to people. It doesn't matter. And you start to create this, like we're doing things, we have no idea what they're going to do in the future with this. That it could be it could be anything that's kind of you know, really creative. Hello, hey, little buddy. So this is creative for our future. So the cool thing about this is I'd love to hear, where do you think this stuff is going? Like, where is the next stage in this kind of agent-centric approach?
Well, I actually want to connect the things that you said back to some of our current situation in Holo, because I do think that it is connected. You said RedGrid is not all the way to the edge yet. Yes and no, right? Like when you have the little smart plugs that can, you know, that's an edge intelligence device. And when it can change the, you know, the AC, the air conditioning you're running, and turn it off or not based on, you know, current demand. And that's pretty edge based. And yet you have to interface with the legacy centralized systems and grid. And that's the same situation that we're in for Holo, in that Holo is interfacing with the legacy web, with domain name resolution, and, you know, basically the centralized way of doing things in terms of centralized address schemes and naming schemes and you know, routing schemes and that type of thing, where Holochain is completely independent of that. And so it's like you can be running a Holochain app that doesn't know anything about domain names, doesn't know, you know, anything about that type of stuff. At the moment, I guess we've only implemented on our networking side, we've only implemented Quick, which does use UDP on IP addresses right now, but that's just, it's configured, that's one transport protocol. We just haven't implemented Bluetooth or you know, Ethernet, or you can have other local things, including other mesh network protocols. So Holochain isn't even inherently bound to internet protocol. It's just that's how everybody wants to access it right now. So that's the only one we've implemented. But you could have similar kinds of scenarios where you're sort of in this hybrid state and you're slowly enabling more and more power at the edge. But ION has to be a bridge also to the centralized infrastructure. And that's what Holo is for Holochain, right? Like Holochain gets to be kind of this pure edge infrastructure thing, but Holo allows us to bridge that. And so you're talking about what do I see coming in the future? And it's like, well, I think that this change happens faster than we realize. You know, right now, nobody really thinks it's possible to be able to have the kinds of things that we have, like Wikipedia and Facebook and Twitter and that kind of stuff, without the surveillance corporations in the middle. We sort of accept them as a necessary evil. But very quickly, as people start to have a comparable experience via Holo-hosted Holochain apps, and then be able to make the jump all the way over to Holochain, like maybe somebody doesn't have solar panels or doesn't have their own energy production or their own energy storage or their own, you know, but as you start to enable some of these things and you start to replace that reliance on the centralized thing, and communities start to understand the resilience of it. And in Australia, you know, it's like when you had all those major outages during the heat waves and, you know, ended up paying, I think, Elon Musk all kinds of stuff for having come in and solved, you know, the demand problem with some of the storage stuff to even out the demand curves. And, you know, it's like when communities start realizing, oh wait, us taking these little steps reduce our independence, they increase our resiliency, they reduce my costs overall, they make me resilient to major, you know, issues. There's a whole bunch of things like that. I think we're going to see that the pressure toward that change is much larger than we know at the moment because of the current blocker that nobody really sees how it's possible. But once it's actually running and people can see it possible, then I think it's sort of going to be opening the floodgates.
Ah, man, I absolutely agree. And that's so interesting because you can't, it's like even just mobile phones, like the thought that these could do what they can do today, that we never would have foreseen, like even 15 years ago, like the level of complexity, the level, as you said, like supercomputer in your pocket, and where we're going to with energy. And there's the kind of technological component there, which is saying, hey, we've got this decentralization. There's going to be resilience that comes from this. It doesn't have to even be internet, as you said. It could be Bluetooth, it could be wire mesh, it could be a whole bunch of things that communities can benefit from. But the other part is, it's very hard for communities so far to participate in these kind of changes really easily, because you have to self-organize as a social organization kind of approach. And some communities have done it super well, but others have found it really hard. And I mean, I've had master students working on some of the community-based renewable energy projects here in Australia. Like, how do they come together? How do they form? And it's really hard work. There's normally a few people who lead it, and they gather everyone together and they get to do it. But what if there was a technology that, I mean, this is what we're building, right? There's a technology that someone can download into their app, into their phone, can start with just a mobile app and start to communicate with those others in that community of that community of practice on energy that they want to form together. And, you know, we've, there's a place where near where we live, and it's not far from the main city. It's about an hour from the city, but the power is just dropping 3 times a week, every week. And like, this is an hour outside of one of Australia's major cities, and it's like the power drops because the connection is difficult, because it's not smart, it's not fluctuating, and yet the 300 houses in the community, we could essentially get together and form this, but we just don't know how to do it because there's no mechanism. So it's that kind of, I think this is why we're really pushing this angle in ION, is that it's so different to the other energy protocols that are out there, which are doing good things and doing interesting things in different ways. But for us, it's like, okay, cool. How do we make this super accessible to absolutely anybody who wants to even stake $10 in it and be part of the system, and then start to play in the system? And as you said, then that small approach then starts to allow them to start to do more and more things, and not even have hardware now. But I mean, the hardware is coming. We're running on, as you said, we're running on hardware, running on smart plugs, running on air conditioning controllers, simple stuff that costs like $10. You can stick it on your washing machine at home or your dryer. Or your air conditioner. And the cool thing with that is, like, you don't have to go, I'm all in for like $10,000 of solar. It's nothing like that. It's like, I'm in for $10 and let's see where this goes. And that's a really different point.
Exactly.
Yeah, I really love that. So with what you're doing at, the next kind of stages in this, you're working on, there's energy, there's water, there's housing, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's happening here. Essentially, this is an ecosystem of new currencies for social environmental good, really, but it's based on pretty hardcore technological economic principles, right? It's not a wish list of stuff. It's a real thing, right?
Well, it's both a wish list and a real thing, right? Like, because I'm looking at, maybe this doesn't belong on this conversation, might not belong on this call, but I'm looking at the resilience of the overall system and some of the unraveling of, nation states and our, capitalist economic structures when we're in kind of a let me say it differently. Industrial age economic structures when we're in a post-industrial age now, right? As to the flavor of their capitalism or not, I am agnostic, but I think we actually push more intelligence to the edges in this because there have been secret monopolies in the capitalist markets with the control of the currencies, for example. And so when we actually can push that out to the edges as well, then we activate even smarter market intelligence by being able to shift those dynamics. And
but like, hey, I wanted to jump on that because this thing, I mean, I saw an article from Paul on NFTs, and and the kind of broader, there's post-industrial society is moving into a society, and I'm like, the jury's still out, right? There's a lot of NFT hype, there's a lot of stuff like that. Okay, that's fair enough, but there's something in there that in my guts that makes me feel like, hey, there's something here which is about shifting some of the way that, you know, artists and others who want to be involved can create something and have a more direct route to some markets. And that's really interesting. Holochain can obviously support that as well, but this is why we're often, I mean, people check our Medium pages, right? And we're all talking about the metaverse for energy. And I remember like a year and a half ago doing a workout and like just listening to some stuff about the metaverse and thinking, and then something just hit me. I was like, there's this, energy is just a currency. It's going to be part of something much bigger. What do we do with energy? We do creative stuff, like we make things. And I love what you're talking about here, because this post-industrial stuff means you don't have to be chained to that industrial way of working. There's other ways of doing things. There's other distributions of wealth. There's a decentralization of who gets to participate in some of these artistic, creative, other endeavors that are built on top of these fundamental human need applications. And I just love that.
Yeah.
Like that's something we're bringing in as well. I just think it's super interesting for the broader narrative. It's not just tech, it's a bigger thing that's happening.
It really is. And there's a weird other thing that I want to throw into the mix, which speaks to the market demand for what it is that we're offering, what it is that ION and RedGrid are offering, what it is that Holo is offering from a hosting perspective. As long as we can use electrons to do work, to do useful work for us, there's not really the likelihood we're going to want to use less of them. Now, the thing is that we can be smarter about how we use them. We can be more energy efficient. We can be smarter about how we produce them, using less carbon, using more renewables, you know, even toward fusion, all those things that have been, you know, kind of labeled as impossible, except I have to wonder if we'd spent as much, you know, on how to extract oil from tar sands, and, you know, how to get more natural gas through fracking, and how to, like, if all the money we'd been investing in that kind of stuff was being invested in fusion, would we already be there?
Yeah.
You know,
it begs the question.
Anyway. Yeah, but the point is, I think we will come up with ways of generating more electricity, clean ways of generating more electricity. But part of that also has to do with breaking the stranglehold, right, of the centralized power. We need the unenclosable carrier for structuring the energy grid in order to actually break the stranglehold of the monopolies of the energy companies as well, and their relationships with the existing and you know, fossil fuel companies and that type of thing, right?
And the shifting market demand, as you said, like people want something different,
right? But the thing that's weird for me about both of our businesses is that there's essentially infinite demand. As long as you can use computing power to do work for you, to think things, to figure out things, to do AI, to do, you know, like, there's not going to be there's not going to be a time where it's like, yeah, we don't really want more computing power. You know, as long as you can use energy to do productive work, it's not like there's going to be a time where it's like, nah, we can't really figure out ways to use that energy if we have ways, right? Like, and so we have essentially an infinite demand if we can come up with the creative and responsible ways to grow our participation in it. That again, as you mentioned earlier, that create kind of the upward co-creative spirals instead of that rely on the sort of downward extractive, we're burning the planet kind of spirals.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really wonderful point to finish on, I think, because that infinite demand for doing responsible and productive use of both hosting and energy it brings good things into the society, right? Because we have more opportunity for more people, and it's quite clear, like, the demand is going to increase. Like, there is, and for both of those things, look at the entire population that don't have access to energy or don't have access to stable hosting right now. That demand is going to go up as our population goes up, and of course as our horizons expand. Like, no one would have thought of NFTs, you know, 6 years ago, but now we have them. Now there's something new there. I mean, it's going to continue to expand. This has been fantastic to have this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. And you know, we get to talk a lot, which I feel very lucky about. And I think it's just awesome to be part of something that is bigger than even just what ION and RedGrid are doing. To be part of something is a much bigger movement that you and the team have been galvanizing. So we're very grateful to you and the team. And yeah, we just can't wait to see where it goes next. And is there any final thoughts that you've got that you'd like to sort of pull out from what we've talked about today?
Just I do want to have it touch ground a little bit. Like, this may sound like all beautiful theory and stuff, but this stuff is working. You can build on Holochain. We have a dev camp with over 1,500 participants happening right now. You have edge devices that you can, like you said, you can get in for just a $10 device, and you're in the midst of creating an offering where people could jump in and get some skin in the game in the next Internet of Energy. And so these things are not like some far off theoretical things. That we have both touched ground and are doing real projects on them. And so it's like, this is the time to play.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great way of putting it. It's the time to play, because it's like, we're not coming at this with just a airy fairy idea. It's real. We've got it in people's hands. People are working on it. We worked all the way together last year working on microgrid stuff here. It is real. It's happening. And yeah, I mean, for ION, we have a launch happening in the next couple of days. So our whitelisting opens in the next couple of days. People can jump in, buy some ION tokens, have access to these discounted future energy prices as a credit system, very similar to HOT and Holofuel. And so look, yeah, for everyone who's watching, please look at the links below, join the Telegram group, join our Twitter, jump in, be part of the community, message us, message Harry, DM Harry if you want to be involved more closely with being an ambassador for ION. But most importantly, stay tuned, and the next 6 months, a year, 3 years are going to be the really exciting bit. But yeah, get involved. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Art, for being with us. Look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Art. Take care.